Welcome. Man the Puppet is not just a book, it's a mirror. In an age where surveillance is silent and control wears the mask of convenience, we risk trading freedom for comfort. Today, algorithms nudge us, screens watch us, and power whispers instead of shouts. But awareness is our rebellion. This book urges us to wake up, not alone but together, as allies in critical thought, in resistance, in reclaiming what it means to be free. Man the Puppet, The Art of Controlling, by Abram Lipsky. Chapter 1, Introduction. The belief that we are at last on the track of psychological laws for controlling the minds of our fellow men has brought about a revolution in the popular attitude towards the science that teaches how to do it. When psychology was groping around for the threshold of consciousness and measuring reaction times, as it did not very long ago, its lure was felt only by a few specialists. The change from studying what mind is to what can be done with minds has made psychology the most popular of sciences. Out of this change has sprung the universal interest in psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, hypnotism, character analysis, mob psychology, salesmanship, all connoting a technique with which one may control the minds of others. The up-to-date salesman considers his prospective customer from the psychological point of view. He approaches the consumer armed with a subtly devised apparatus for controlling his volition. In influencing the mind of another, writes Professor Walter Dill Scott, it is of importance to know in what terms he is thinking, so that the construction of the argument may be best adapted to his particular mental processes, for in this way he can be most easily influenced. The salesman is expected to study his prospect's dominant instincts and play upon his latent desires. The universal urge to control the minds of others, for the satisfaction of which the methods we know today have been developed, is not new. It was felt in the Stone Age. Salesmanship was unknown, but love, medicine, religion, and polities were even then not without devotees. The Chippewa Indian who wished to make one of the opposite sex love him carried around her image, pinched its heart, and inserted magic powders in the punctures. A Dayak medicine man who has been fetched in a case of illness lies down and pretends to be dead, is treated like a corpse, wound up in mats, taken out of the house and deposited on the ground, and when after an hour, other medicine men loose the pretended dead man and bring him to life, the invalid recovers too. The struggle between individuals in civilized society is obviously not one in which the contestants are engaged in trying to snatch something from one another, but rather an effort to get somebody to relinquish something, to part with his money in return for wares or services, to choose you for a husband or a wife, to vote for you or your measure, to render a verdict in your favor, to praise you in public. Pleading at the bar of public opinion or in the legal forum is an effort to win over minds to the propositions of the orator. Statesmen are helpless without the cooperation of their fellow statesmen. The physician's personality counts for more towards success than his science, not only in attracting patients, but in actually healing them. Of what avail are priceless virtues in the lover if he cannot make them visible to her whom he courts? All have need more or less of the actor's talents, for all are under the necessity of putting something across, getting the acquiescence of others to their own visions, convictions, and projects. It is well understood that the verdicts of juries are not rendered solely upon evidence or in strict accord with the principles of scientific induction. This explains the interminable inquisition of talesmen by opposing counsel, who know that very much depends upon whether the jurors are married or single, old or young, rich or poor, pillars of society or proletarians. Among 12 jurors, you have the possibility of 12 or more biases, of which both sides seek to take advantage. In the case of an old man on trial for wife murder, defendant's counsel has been known to manifest a predilection for old men who have been married. A young woman accused of killing a false lover has her fate entrusted, if her lawyer can manage it, to the hands of romantic young men. Demagogues, since the beginning of political history, have understood the tactics of indirect assault upon the mind of the demos. In Caesar's time, Guglielmo Ferrero tells us, the merest trifle, a well-placed rumor or a fortunate phrase, would sometimes alter all the probabilities of the situation between night and morning, leading perhaps, by some sudden freak of popular feeling, to a result which was equally surprising to all parties concerned. Such surprises, with the best men and arguments on one side but the victory going to the other side, are not unknown in modern politics. The direct appeal may have been addressed to the reason of the voters, the indirect suggestions to the plebeian disowned, but very powerful feelings, prejudices, complexes lurking out of sight. It is commonly thought that the state rests upon force. So it does, but it first has to get the force, and this it can only do by first controlling minds. The theory that kings were evolved from the strongest and boldest warriors of primitive tribes was overemphasized by Herbert Spencer. It has been shown by J.G. Fraser, with an immense array of evidence, to be far from the whole story. The royal line frequently starts with the medicine man, or public magician, who brings rain when it is needed and sends it away when there has been enough, who supervises the growth of the crops, drives away pestilence, and in general, practices sorcery for the benefit of the whole community. Now, how does the public magician become king? Not, of course, by the display of physical power, but solely by impressing upon the minds of his contemporaries the belief that power of another sort is at his command, namely, that derived from the spirit world. It is a profession, says Fraser, that draws to its ranks the ablest and most ambitious men of the tribe because it holds out to them a prospect of honor, wealth, and power, such as hardly any other career can offer. The acuter minds perceive how easy it is to dupe their weaker brethren for their own advantage. The general result is that at this stage of evolution, the supreme power tends to fall into the hands of the keenest intelligence and the most unscrupulous character. A happy coincidence is probably necessary to give the medicine man a start. Once going, however, he makes use of a set of stage properties especially calculated to heighten his prestige. A grotesque and awe-inspiring headpiece, a painted or tattooed face, unusual garments, a wand, and other accessories. Hypnotic dancing and weird charms muttered rhythmically help in weaving the spell over his subjects. How suggestive these things are of the contrivances employed by the kings of civilized states for sticking to their thrones. The so-called regalia, the ermine, crown, scepter, rings, the bewildering processions, ceremonials, and rituals, divine descent, divine right to rule, and supernatural healing powers are but of yesterday. The state has to use psychological methods to rally its friends and confound its enemies. This discovery, that the real basis of the state is psychological, has burst with startling violence upon men's minds in the last few years. Political constitutions have been seen wavering and dissolving into air. Every nation has been asking itself the fearful question, what shall we do if the proletariat takes it into its head to dictate? The only answer is that the proletariat must be prevented, as it has been for the most part successfully in the past, from getting any such idea fixed in its head. A bit of Dr. Samuel Johnson's conversation with Boswell is curiously apt. Providence has wisely ordered that the more numerous men are, the more difficult it is for them to agree in anything, and say are governed. There is no doubt that if the poor should reason, will be the poor no longer, will make the rich take their turn, they could easily do it, were it not that they can't agree. So the common soldiers, though so much more numerous than their officers, are governed by them for the same reason. It was Machiavelli who advised the ruler to keep the populace contented by lavish entertainment, to enhance his own prestige by a great show of munificence, and by successful war. These devices are of doubtful efficacy at the present time, although they have been of service in the past not only to autocracies, but to many a democracy. The state has more effective weapons than these: churches, schools, moral codes, the press, legends of heroic founders, fathers and defenders of the country, slogans and songs, myths, and all the familiar apparatus for quickening patriotism may be relied upon, if wisely used, to dissipate the irrational impulse to govern by the brute force of numbers. It must be apparent that the endeavor to control the minds of other men is universal in human society. The struggle for existence is not the clash of opposing bodies usually pictured, but rather a vast campaign of conciliation, persuasion, and seduction. Man, as an individual, is more interested in getting others to do things for him than in controlling the forces of nature. Single-handed, he can exercise but an insignificant control over nature. But if he succeeds in controlling the minds of his fellows, he may well leave them to struggle with nature while he gathers in the world's prizes. John Smith, hustling for a living in the world, has more need of his fluent speech, agreeable presence, and amiability than of his physical strength or learning. When the clash of wills takes place between parties, classes, or nations, a large part of the struggle consists in persuading the hostile forces to dissolve and disperse, in dissipating the enemy's organization or converting it into a friendly one. The process of mental control is employed by individuals in seeking advancement, by classes in clinging to privileges or reaching out for more, by governments in getting power, and by the enemies of government in fomenting revolutions. Man, evolutionists have pointed out, has ceased developing specialized physical organs of offense and defense in the struggle for existence. Left to his physical equipment, he would succumb, but he has an immeasurable advantage in brain power, which enables him to work in groups, in nations, and makes possible the mobilization of the past, as well as the present against his racial enemies. The internal struggle going on between individuals and classes, unceasingly, is also of a peculiar character. The weapons are powers of persuasion and mental control. The strategic objective is to gain allies. In other words, friends, patrons, creditors, business connections, clients, patients, matrimonial alliances. Solid attainments are, of course, useful, but chiefly in gaining recognition. For the individual, the advantage of scientific or artistic achievement comes down at last to a question of salesmanship. What can the scientist or artist induce somebody to give for what he has discovered or created? The inventor does not put his invention to work, but has to sell it to a capitalist who reaps the bulk of the profits. He in turn sells it or its products to the public. Sopranos, tenors, violinists, prize fighters are helpless without a manager to sell their abilities for them. The prodigious financial returns of a modern bestseller, as compared with the trifling sum paid by Paradise Lost, measure the difference between the feeble salesmanship of the age of Milton and that of Sinclair Lewis. The individual who creates what is beautiful or useful needs, in order to succeed, the art also of persuading men. Chapter 2. Thwarting the common man. The mad impulse of the majority to rule appears to break out at long intervals. The French Revolution and the Bolshevik uprising are commonly accepted as examples of such eruptions from the lower depths. We know, however, that in the French Revolution, spontaneous outbursts of popular wrath were carefully elaborated in advance by the Jacobin leaders. Lenin and his colleagues have themselves told how much they trusted to the Russian masses for the installation of the communist millennium. During these secular scares, the innocent bystander is afflicted with a doubt whether government as such, not any particular form of government, can be kept going. The truth that government is fundamentally a contrivance for the preservation of conditions favorable to those who have been successful in getting what they want is then revealed in lightning flashes. The less successful, not having a low opinion of their own powers, but attributing to chance, fate, fraud, or the rules of the game their inferior lot, would not be averse, the lucky but fearful minority surmises, to a new deal or a change in the rules of the game. The problem that then confronts the rulers of society is how to convince the majority of the people that the chances are against an improvement of their lot by reshuffling the cards, and prove to them that ill luck, force, and fraud would not be wiped out by a new deal, a new distribution of places, property, and privileges. Democracy was once supposed to be such a new deal, but radicals now speak with derision of political democracy. It gets the masses nothing. The attack upon political democracy has gained in respectability in recent years. It has become rather commonplace to point out that the greater the scale upon which democracy is attempted, the less we have of it. James Bryce asserted that no city of more than 300,000 inhabitants can be well governed. Chesterton and Belloc have shown that in democratic England, the cabinet is self-perpetuating, that positions in the government are handed out to the members of a few powerful families, that the seeming conflict between government and opposition is staged for the appeasement of the populace, while behind the scenes both parties meet in a convivial spirit the changes in a ministry involving no fundamental change in the governing oligarchy. In the United States, it does not imply hostility to true democracy to favor the short ballot or commission government of cities. One may remain 100% American while remembering that the House of Representatives never got through with more business than in the days of Czar Reed, and that few legislative bodies ever gave such exhibitions of inability to function as our democratically elected Senate on several important recent occasions. It is often asserted in defense of the democratic principle that the trouble with existing democracies is that they do not go far enough. That the cure for faulty democracy is more democracy. Make democracy universal. Extend it to industry, to the schools, to the churches, to every form of human endeavor. But when we inspect the organizations that are held up as models of pure democracy, we find little to support this contention. Professor Robert Michel is, in his interesting book on political parties, has shown that labor unions and working men's political parties also suffer from lapses from the democratic ideal. The present officials of the American Federation of Labor have held office for a generation. They get themselves re-elected, add to their own body, and propose legislation to which the members of the organization assent as a matter of duty. The same is true of the General Federation of Labor of France. The highest posts in that most revolutionary of all labor organizations are filled by a process that amounts to appointment by the chief secretary. The leaders of the old German socialist and trade union parties were similarly permanent until removed by death or resignation. The resemblance between these phenomena and the familiar one in American politics of bosses like Platt, Quay, Murphy, Croker, Aldrich, and others, holding on to power for life, or until satiated, will be readily recognized. Revolutions brought about in the name of democracy itself show the same domination by individuals and small groups. There were only 5,000 Jacobins, according to Taine, in a Parisian population of 700,000, but they acted for the entire French people. If we had to wait until the masses of the Russian proletariat were educated up to socialism, said Lenin, we would have to wait 500 years. The Socialist Party is the vanguard of the working class. It must not allow itself to be halted by the lack of education of the mass average, but must lead the mass using the Soviet as organ of revolutionary initiative. And we may consider the fact established that democracy has a tendency to slip into something undemocratic, to breed a principle antagonistic to itself. In every democracy, we see individuals and minority groups controlling the administration or the government. By what mechanism do they impose their will upon the many? If government rests ultimately upon force, as Hobbes, Spencer, Tolstoy, and others have maintained, there is here a paradox calling for explanation. The majority have the force, yet minorities rule. Shelley, it seems, thought the majority only needed stirring up. In his song Men of England, he cries, "Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Slow shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." What sort of chains are these that have fallen upon the many? Obviously, they are not of a physical nature. The few do not forcibly compel the many to bear the burdens of society. They convince them that it is right and true happiness to do so. The majority is not compelled, it is persuaded. What are the devices by which the masses are kept from throwing off the yoke? To begin with, no political boss, demagogue, or oligarch fails to do homage to the dogma of the sovereignty of the majority in public. Just as the shoguns could rule only in the name of the Mikado, and the mayors of the palace only in the name of the Merovingian kings, so every ruling oligarchy must entrench itself behind the proclamation that the true source of power and the only rightful sovereign is the majority. This is another illustration of mimicry, as known to biologists. The assumption by relatively weaker creatures of known and dreaded aspects of power in order to paralyze and subdue others better armed than themselves with mere physical capacity. A minority in the political field mimics the majority by making a noise like a great multitude, with mass meetings, much public speaking, letters to the papers, league-long petitions. It thus appears like a great host attacking simultaneously at 100 places, which is classical strategy of weaker against stronger forces in actual warfare. Gideon of the Old Testament divided his small army into 3 parts, which he ordered at night to 3 widely separated stations around his much stronger enemy. The 3 bands stood waving torches, blowing trumpets and shouting, "The sword of the Lord in Gideon!" And the Midianites and the Amalekites, who were like grasshoppers for multitude, ran and cried and fled. Napoleon at Arcola used the same device. "I gave every man a trumpet and gained the day with this handful." So the Jacobins in the French Revolution spoke for the Third Estate, and finally, Robespierre spoke for the Jacobins. The Russian communists speak for the proletariat, and Lenin or his successor for the communists. The Anti-Saloon League spoke for all the moral people in the United States. Mimicry of the majority is assisted by a complementary psychological state, aptly named by Bryce, the fatalism of the multitude, also known as gregarious inertia. This is a state of indifference, especially characteristic of the citizens of large democracies. It shows itself, for example, in an aversion to taking part in primaries and a willingness to let professionals run them. The dislike of voting on the losing side may be considered an expression of the same instinct. In England, it appears as reverence for tradition and custom. The masses look on in awe at mysteries they do not comprehend. Those who are admitted to the inner circle of the governing class are persuaded sooner or later to play the game. A half-dozen determined men, it has been said, could overthrow the system in Parliament, but thus far, reverence has prevailed. The psychology of ancient democracies was the same. In Rome, the voting was done at the Capitol, and comparatively few of the citizens could or did come to the city to vote. That duty was left to the professionals, largely the venal proletariat, whom the bosses were adept at controlling. Citizens are not without valid excuses for their inertia. They have not the time to learn the routine of political procedure, to acquaint themselves with precedent and statute, to master the ritual of nomination and election. They have not the time to study the personal histories of dozens of candidates, or the difficult problems of economics and sociology with which politics are concerned. The average citizen is not criminally negligent. His dependence upon the professional politician is practically unavoidable. He does not object to being governed, provided he is well governed. Students of democracy discover with some surprise that the bosses are in favor of more and ever more democracy. It suits the purposes of the bosses very well to give the voters many candidates and measures to vote for. The multiplicity of choices thrust upon the voter is sure to make him incapable of any intelligent choice whatever. He is compelled to leave the task of selection to the professional expert, who presents him with a slate to which he can say only yes or no. Another device for swaying the majority is to make it appear that your candidates are inevitably destined to succeed anyway. It is easy to win an election if you can convince a majority that you already have the votes. This sounds paradoxical, but it describes the tactics of every political manager, whose objective is a stampede initiated by the clack method. This is the purpose of ringing predictions of success, straw votes, quotations of betting odds, in short, all the tricks designed to convince the populace that nothing remains to be done but a perfunctory casting of ballots in an issue already decided. The familiar convention stampede appears to the uninitiated as a boiling over from the depths of emotion and enthusiasm, mystical, irrational, and unpredictable. Insofar as volume and power are concerned, these explosions are all that. The directors behind the scenes, however, do not leave the inauguration of the tumult to chance. The mechanism of its provocation is planned with a profound knowledge of human nature. There is a slow kind of stampede or mass contagion which is engendered by ideas, rational in themselves, but operating in a hypnoidal manner. The idea of inevitability, offered in our day as a corollary to the theory of evolution, is one of them. This is the fatalism of the Darwinian age. Put into logical form, it runs something like this. Since progress is cosmic, impersonal, and irresistible, we as individuals have only to divine its course and get out of its way. It is wicked and foolish to oppose the next step of progress once that is authoritatively announced, and so getting on the bandwagon becomes a profoundly philosophic act. The growth of socialism before the war was an illustration of this glacial kind of stampede. Certainly nothing contributed so much to its expansion as the dogma of inevitability which Karl Marx had made part of socialist theology. Herbert Spencer spoke pathetically of socialism as the coming slavery. Society in the picture he drew was a hypnotized bird waiting to be swallowed by the cosmic snake, which for some inscrutable reason belonged to the socialist species. The spread of prohibition sentiment and the adoption of the 18th Amendment may fairly be considered illustrative of the same process. Friends of Prohibition proclaimed it the next step in social evolution. The liquor dealers' organization fought with constantly waning courage. The great body of American citizens awaited with the fatalism of the multitude the inevitable triumph of the next step. The most effective bulwark of government is the word. Put into slogans, catchwords, shibboleths, or stereotypes, it is worth more than legions. Who can calculate in military units the defensive value to America of phrases like the Constitution? It was said by an ancient Greek that democracy is a state in which everything, even the laws, depend upon the multitude set up as a tyrant and governed by a few declamatory speakers. Plato noted the fact that oratory is the art of ruling the minds of men. No British man can attain to be a statesman or chief of workers till he has proved himself a chief of talkers, said Carlyle. And Emerson, it is eminently the art which flourishes only in free countries. The instruments on which orators play are democratic assemblies. The value of print to the art of government is no new discovery. Julius Caesar grasped its importance when he had a law passed ordering certain magistrates to post the news of the day on whitewashed walls in different parts of the city, so that even the poorest Roman, who could not subscribe to the hand-copied booklets that served as newspapers, might inform himself gratis on current events. Was it likely that the magistrates whose duty it was to post the news would allow anything that was damaging to the sponsor of the law to appear? William Jennings Bryan, not long ago, advocated the establishment by the government of publicly owned newspapers, apparently unaware of Caesar's priority to credit for this political invention. A government that is threatened from within immediately strikes at its enemy's verbal machinery. It imposes a censorship on speech and printing, shuts off the flow of argument, and at the same time institutes departments of intelligence and information. Cromwell ruthlessly suppressed all hostile prints. The Bolsheviki have maintained themselves in power largely through their understanding of this tactical principle. Their first move was to gain possession of the newspaper offices. They forthwith began snowing Russia with printed paper. No newspapers appeared but their own. In the debate that followed with the more sentimental wing of the party, the victorious dictators gave this candid justification of their policy. The suppression of the bourgeois press was dictated not only by the purely military needs of the cause of the insurrection and for the checking of the counter-revolutionary activity, but it is also necessary as a means of transition toward the establishment of a new regime, under which the capitalist owners of printing presses cannot be the all-powerful and exclusive manufacturers of public opinion. It was resolved that the manufacture of public opinion, as of all other commodities, should be kept in the hands of the government. The war between the Bolsheviki and their opponents became a war of printing presses. The Bolsheviki were well prepared for a campaign of words. All their leaders were journalists: Lenin, Trotsky, Chicherin, Karakan, Radek, Bukharin, Kamenev, Lunacharsky. Although the Bolshevik propaganda was masterly from a literary point of view, their main reliance was not upon argument, but upon news. Controlling the sources of information, they fed out nothing detrimental to their prestige, but only glowing reports of the success of Bolshevism in Russia and of the conversion of the world to its principles. It would be a mistake to assume that democracies alone make use of the psychological means of government. An autocracy, which is usually thought to rest upon force, depends perhaps more than any other form of government upon imponderable psychological support. The difference between democracy and autocracy is simply that in the one there are constitutional methods for determining the will of the majority, while in the other the channels for the expression of the popular will have to be broken afresh at every crisis. Autocracy, too, is obliged to create public opinion. Cromwell controlled the English by means of an army of 50,000 devoted men, but to get their services he had to persuade them. Louis XIV was able to remain at the apex of one of the most complete despotisms that Europe has ever known, by watching and humoring the bishops who taught the people to obey. The Russian church served tsardom by dinning into the ears of the peasants the doctrine of the sanctity and benevolence of the Little Father. Kaiser Wilhelm II was obliged to make an ally of God. The cooperation of theocracy with autocracy is shown throughout history. After the revolution had abolished Christianity in France, Robespierre discovered that his dictatorship had nothing but air under it. He saw his political structure beginning to topple unless he buttressed it with a cult. He was driven to inaugurate the worship of the Supreme Being, with himself as high priest. Napoleon ordered the teaching of that remarkable catechism of his in the public schools, in which the children professed loyalty to their protector and benefactor, because he is head of the Church Universal. He preferred Catholicism to Anglicanism, he said privately, because in the former, the people did not understand the words they sang. Alexander the Great, after conquering Egypt, spent a month of the most difficult marching through the Sahara to the oasis of Siwa in order to have himself proclaimed by the oracle that dwelt there as the son of Zeus. This was not a vain and foolish act. From what I have said, writes Plutarch, it is evident that Alexander was not mentally affected or insanely puffed up, but was merely seeking to maintain authority over others through the claim of divinity. Alexander's deification was a political device. Its purpose was to consolidate his rule over the cities of Greece, as well as the races of Asia and Africa. To Alexander the Great, governments have been in serious debt for over 2,000 years. From him to Wilhelm II runs an unbroken line. Altars and temples were dedicated to Julius Caesar, the next universal divine king in his lifetime. His statue was set up in the Temple of Quirinus with the inscription, "To the unconquerable God." His image was drawn through the streets with those of the immortal gods. A temple was decreed in honor of Jupiter Julius. In a decree of the Council of Ephesus, he is described as the God made manifest, the son of Ares and Aphrodite. His successor Augustus had a statue 50 feet high on the Palatine, representing him with the attributes of Apollo. The interest of Augustus in religion was conspicuously displayed. As Pontifex Maximus, he was the head of the religious hierarchy, official guardian of religion, and by virtue of other religious offices, in control of the entire religious machinery of the state. The deification of Greek kings and Roman emperors was not a sign of religious piety, but of political astuteness. Deification of living rulers was the product not of superstition, but of irreligion. It was the classical method of legalizing absolutism, the psychological instrument for obtaining political submission. Religion was necessary to every form of government in the ancient world, whether oligarchy, monarchy, or democracy. No government could live without this mechanism of control. It seems probable that none could today. The ancient saying, "It were as easy to build a city on air as to construct a state without belief in the gods," still holds true. Modern democracy, although officially divorced from religion, still represents itself as the fulfillment of the religious ideal. If it opposes traditional religion, as in Russia, it makes a religion of itself. De Tocqueville shrewdly remarked that a politician in the United States who should express dissent from one particular religious denomination might not have that sect against him, but if he were known as a religious skeptic in general, he would have everybody against him. The idea that a government can rest indefinitely upon force is seen, after a little analysis, to be an absurdity. It is true a government can perpetrate atrocities for the purpose of intimidation, but whom will it get to do the hangman's work? The king cannot go out himself single-handed. Someone must be induced to enlist, to fight. The problem then, in the first place, is to enlist a sufficient number of fighters. But even after that point has been gained, it is plain that a population that should refuse to be intimidated by exhibitions of violence and terrorism could not be governed by force. The government might shoot some of these obstinate people, but that would not be governing them, and if the majority of the population persisted in not being impressed, the whole adventure must fail. He who becomes master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it may expect to be destroyed by it, wrote Machiavelli. But massacre is not government. Exhibitions of power to succeed, must be accompanied by suitable propaganda, setting forth the justice and wisdom of the government's action. In the absence of such considerations, violence is just as likely as not to arouse revolt, which only needs organization to become irresistible. In a democracy, fear has a very limited field of usefulness as an engine of government. The masses are governed by implanting in them the conviction that the government is their own and its ends their ends. Whether this conviction be true or not, the state could not survive if the majority did not think it was. There are always a few individuals who cannot be convinced, who are not amenable to the influence of the church, the press, or the schools. In times of peace, it is often admitted that such persons, secreting somehow a corrective against mob madness, serve a useful purpose. But they are intolerable in wartime, when a nation prefers to be mad. It was Machiavelli who first set forth objectively the psychological technique of government. We are much beholden to Machiavelli and others who wrote what men do and not what they ought to do, says Francis Bacon. In The Prince, he set out the principles of realpolitik, as practiced since by Queen Elizabeth, Napoleon, and Bismarck. If you wish to get power, he taught, you have to use such and such moral or psychological devices. For instance, win the affection, confidence, and respect of your subjects by every possible means. He was not scrupulous about the means. Since you govern only by consent, get a reputation for courage, power, justice, liberality, chastity, faithfulness, and all the most esteemed virtues. It is not necessary, he adds, that a prince should have all the qualities I have enumerated above, but it is essential that he should seem to have them. There is the odious Machiavellian touch. Defenders of Machiavelli put forward the plea that a good deal of his diabolism is attributable to the morals of the age in which he lived rather than to him personally. The plea is unnecessary. Machiavellism inheres in the very business of getting and exercising political power. No one expects a statesman, let alone a politician, to tell the whole truth. It is recognized that the motives of politicians must often remain hidden from the people, or the politicians would be swept aside. Complete frankness would not be understood. It is impracticable. A politically trained citizenry tacitly accepts the principle that the personal beliefs or prejudices of candidates for office are of less consequence than their official intentions. A candidate who seeks the suffrage of a large multitude must hit upon the greatest common denominator in opinions. The greater the multitude, the slighter the thought content in the principles which are acceptable to the majority. The basic truth, which seldom can be spoken, is that candidates for office seek power. It may be put moralistically, as Theodore Roosevelt did, when he wrote in a private letter that he wished to be re-elected to the presidency because the job made it possible for him to do big things. The art of government is a technique for controlling the common man.